The contrail painted itself across Nevada's bleeding sunset like a dying prayer, its white vapor twisting into patterns that shouldn't exist. Major Kestrel Wraith Voss pressed her face against the briefing room window, watching the impossible geometry dissolve into evening air. Behind her, 12 F-22 Raptor pilots shuffled through mission folders, their voices a low hum of routine confidence. None of them saw what she saw. None of them remembered what she couldn't forget. "Gentleman and lady," Colonel Marcus Webb's voice cut through the chatter like a blade through silk. The emphasis on lady carried its usual weight of tolerant dismissal. Kestrel turned from the window, her gray eyes catching the fluorescent light like flint striking steel. 23 combat missions over Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Distinguished Flying Cross. Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. Still, to most of them, she remained an anomaly in a cockpit, a quota fulfilled rather than a warrior earned. The mission briefing felt standard, routine patrol over restricted airspace, but Kestrel's fingers traced the edge of her flight suit pocket, where a photograph lived against her ribs. Captain Alina Reyes, missing in action, presumed dead. 3 years, 2 months, 16 days ago. The trail smoke she'd watched moments earlier matched the emergency signal pattern Alina had developed during their time at Nellie's. A pattern nobody else would recognize. A pattern that should have died with her wingman. Webb gestured toward the tactical display, red dots marking their patrol route. Weather's clear, visibility unlimited, standard formation flying. We own the sky up there, people. His confidence filled the room like expensive cologne, cloying and artificial. But Kestrel's attention remained fixed on the mission coordinates. They passed directly through the airspace where Alina had vanished during a classified night operation. The official report blamed equipment failure, pilot error, controlled flight into terrain. Kestrel had read between those sanitized lines and found only questions that ate at her sleep. Outside, another contrail began forming in the distance, this one different, deliberate. The vapor streams pulsed in 3-second intervals, then 2, then 4. Morse code and skywriting, Alina's signature, Alina's promise, Alina's impossible return from the dead. Kestrel's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, finding the small silver cross Alina had given her the night before that final mission. "Watch over me, Wraith," Alina had whispered. "The sky keeps its secrets, but it always brings us home." Now the sky was speaking in Alina's voice, and Kestrel was the only one listening. The briefing continued around her, but her world had narrowed to that window and the message written in dissipating water vapor. Someone was alive out there. Someone was trying to communicate. Someone needed her to remember what everyone else had been ordered to forget. The mission would launch in 40 minutes. 40 minutes to solve a 3-year-old mystery that officially didn't exist. 40 minutes to prepare for whatever waited in the restricted airspace where the dead refused to stay buried. Kestrel checked her watch and began counting backwards toward the truth. Webb dismissed the briefing with military efficiency, but Kestrel lingered at the window until the last contrail faded into darkness. Tomorrow's dawn would bring answers or consequences. In her experience, they were often the same thing. She gathered her gear and walked toward the hangar, where her F-22 waited like a silver prayer beneath the Nevada stars. The Raptor's designation was painted in block letters across the nose, Wraith 07. Alina had chosen that call sign for her, claiming Kestrel moved through the sky like a ghost seeking vengeance. Tonight, that description felt prophetic. The hangar buzzed with pre-flight activity as ground crews performed final checks on $12 million killing machines. Kestrel ran her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, her hands knowing every surface, every switch, every system that would either save her life or end it. The F-22's twin Pratt and Whitney engines gleamed in the overhead lighting like mechanical hearts waiting to beat. She traced her fingers along the aircraft's skin, feeling for any imperfection that might betray her at altitude. "Still talking to your airplane, Wraith?" Lieutenant Colonel Jake Thunderbolt Morrison appeared beside her, his tone carrying the casual condescension she'd learned to expect. Morrison flew like he lived, aggressively, loudly, with absolute certainty in his own superiority. He'd never shot down an enemy aircraft, but he'd shot down plenty of careers with his political connections and his father's Pentagon influence. "Just making sure she's ready to bring me home," Kestrel replied without looking up from her inspection. Her voice carried no emotion, no invitation to conversation. Morrison had been Alina's squadron mate too, but he'd accepted the official story without question, without grief, without the sleepless nights that plagued anyone who truly understood what they'd lost. "Home," Morrison repeated, as if the word tasted strange. "You know what I think. I think you never really left whatever hole they pulled you out of in Afghanistan. Some of us adapt to peacetime flying. Others just keep fighting wars that ended years ago." Kestrel's hand stilled on the aircraft's canopy. Morrison's words carried an edge she hadn't heard before, something that suggested knowledge rather than casual cruelty. She turned to face him fully, studying the confidence in his posture, the slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," Morrison said, but his smile widened. "Just wondering if you're still chasing ghosts up there." He gestured toward the ceiling, toward the sky beyond. "The dead don't send messages, Wraith. They don't write letters in smoke. They just stay dead and let the living get on with business." The hangar's ambient noise seemed to fade around them. Kestrel felt her heartbeat accelerate, felt the familiar pre-combat tension building in her shoulders. Morrison knew something. His casual mention of smoke messages, of ghosts, of things staying dead, it wasn't coincidence. It was warning disguised as mockery. "What do you know about Alina Reyes?" Morrison's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a microsecond of genuine surprise before the practiced arrogance returned. "I know she's dead. I know her family received a folded flag and a letter of condolence signed by people who never knew her name. I know some questions are better left unasked." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I also know that certain classified operations require absolute discretion, from everyone involved, past, present, and future." Kestrel felt ice forming in her veins. Morrison wasn't just making conversation. He was delivering a message from someone higher up the chain of command, someone who knew about the contrails, about Alina, about whatever had really happened in that restricted airspace 3 years ago. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm reminding you that some secrets serve the greater good," Morrison replied, "and some pilots who dig too deep find themselves reassigned to weather reconnaissance in Alaska, permanently." He touched the brim of his flight cap in a mock salute. "Have a safe flight tonight, Wraith. Stick to the mission parameters. Don't chase shadows." He walked away, leaving Kestrel alone with her aircraft and a growing certainty that tonight's patrol was anything but routine. Someone wanted her in that restricted airspace. Someone else wanted her to stay away. Alina's ghost was caught between them, speaking in smoke signals that only Kestrel could read. She finished her pre-flight inspection and climbed into the cockpit, settling into the ejection seat that had carried her through too many battles to count. The F-22s systems hummed to life around her, multi-million-dollar technology responding to her touch like an extension of her own nervous system. She ran through the startup sequence with practiced efficiency, but her mind remained fixed on Morrison's words. Weather reconnaissance in Alaska. That's what happened to pilots who asked uncomfortable questions about classified operations. That's what happened to women who refused to accept the official version of their friends' deaths. Kestrel activated her radio and checked in with the control tower. "Tower, Wraith 07, requesting permission to taxi." "Wraith 07 Tower, you're cleared to taxi runway 27 right. Winds calm, visibility unlimited. Flight of 12 departing in sequence." The other pilots were already moving toward their aircraft, their pre-flight bravado replaced by the focused intensity that preceded combat operations. Even routine patrols demanded respect in an F-22. The margin between life and death existed in milliseconds at 40,000 feet, measured in degrees of angle and pounds per square inch of air pressure. Kestrel taxied into position behind Morrison's aircraft, watching his engines glow cherry red in the darkness ahead. Raptor Flight, this is Tower. You're cleared for takeoff. Maintain heading 270, climb to flight level 400. Contact approach control on 254.7. Have a good flight. Morrison's F-22 accelerated down the runway, its twin engines tearing holes in the night air. The sound was pure violence, controlled thunder that spoke of American engineering supremacy and the political will to project power anywhere on Earth within 18 hours. Kestrel followed 30 seconds later, feeling the familiar compression of acceleration as 35,000 pounds of thrust pressed her into her seat. The runway lights blurred past her canopy, then fell away beneath as her aircraft lifted into the Nevada darkness. At 10,000 feet, she could see the lights of Las Vegas sprawling across the desert like a circuit board plugged into the continental power grid. Above her, stars appeared in the crystal-clear air, their ancient light traveling impossible distances to witness whatever drama was about to unfold in Earth's atmosphere. The radio crackled with routine check-ins as the other pilots reported their positions and system status. Everything normal, everything by the book. But Kestrel's eyes remained fixed on her navigation display, watching the distance tick down toward the coordinates where Alina had disappeared. 15 miles, 10 miles, 5 miles. The restricted airspace opened before them like a wound in the night sky, empty and waiting. Her radar showed no contacts, no traffic, no signs of life. Just emptiness and the memory of a friend who had vanished into this same darkness 3 years ago. Raptor Flight, approach control. You're cleared into restricted area Romeo 4407. Maintain current heading and altitude. Report any unusual contacts or activities immediately. Kestrel keyed her radio. Approach Wraith 07. Entering restricted airspace, all systems normal. But nothing about this felt normal. The air itself seemed different here, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. She checked her defensive systems, verified her weapon's status, and prepared for whatever Alina's ghost was trying to tell her. In the distance, a new contrail began forming against the star-filled sky. This one was different from the others, more deliberate, more complex. It pulsed and twisted through a sequence that made Kestrel's breath catch in her throat. Not Morse code this time. Something else. Something only she would understand. Alina's personal signal system, developed during their time as flight instructors at Nellie's, when they'd taught younger pilots how to survive in aerial combat. A system based on their shared memory of a night in Qatar, when they'd been forced to communicate without radio during a sandstorm that grounded everything else in theater. The contrail spelled out 3 words in Alina's private code: remember the promise. Kestrel's hand moved instinctively to the silver cross at her throat. The promise. The night before Alina's final mission, they'd sat on the roof of their quarters, watching meteors streak across the desert sky. Alina had been unusually quiet, her normal confidence replaced by something that looked like premonition. If anything happens to me, she'd said, if I don't come back from whatever they're sending me to do, promise me you'll find the truth. Promise me you won't let them bury it with bureaucracy and classification stamps. Kestrel had promised, the way friends promise impossible things to ease each other's fears. She'd never expected to honor that promise. Alina was too good a pilot, too careful, too skilled to make the kind of mistake that killed flyers. But Alina had died anyway officially in a classified accident that left no wreckage, no witnesses, no evidence beyond a brief paragraph in the squadron's monthly activity report. Now Alina's ghost was reminding her of that promise, writing it across the sky in vapor trails that would dissipate before anyone else could decode them. The dead weren't supposed to communicate with the living. Officially, they couldn't. But Alina had never been particularly concerned with official regulations when something more important was at stake, like the truth, like justice, like the promise 2 friends had made under a desert sky full of falling stars. Kestrel adjusted her heading slightly, following the direction indicated by the contrail's vector. Her radar remained clear, but she could feel something waiting out there in the darkness. Someone, something. the ghost of a promise that refused to stay buried with the woman who had extracted it. The radio buzzed with routine communications from the other pilots, but their voices seemed to come from a different world, a safer world where friends didn't vanish into classified operations and leave only questions behind. The contrail was fatting now, its message delivered and received, but new ones were forming in the distance, multiple trails converging on a point about 30 miles northeast of her current position. Kestrel checked her fuel status and her mission parameters. She had enough gas to investigate and still make it home. The question was whether she had enough courage to follow Alina's ghost into whatever truth was waiting out there in the restricted airspace where secrets went to die. She keyed her radio and reported her position to the flight leader, keeping her voice steady and professional. Thunder 01, Wraith 07, investigating possible air traffic anomaly bearing 045, range 28 miles, maintaining altitude. Morrison's voice crackled back immediately, sharp with authority and something that might have been concern. Wraith 07, Thunder 01, negative on the deviation. Maintain current patrol pattern. I show no traffic on scope. But Kestrel was already turning northeast, following the convergence point indicated by the contrails. Her F-22 responded like a living thing, its fly-by-wire controls translating her intentions into precise movements through three-dimensional space. At Mach 1.2, the distance closed quickly, and her radar finally began showing contacts ahead. Multiple aircraft in formation, flying without transponders, without identification, without any of the electronic signatures that marked normal military or civilian traffic. Ghost planes flown by ghost pilots, gathering in the middle of nowhere for reasons that officially didn't exist. Kestrel's threat warning system remained silent, but every instinct developed through 23 combat missions was screaming that she was flying into something much larger and more dangerous than a routine patrol. The kind of something that swallowed good pilots and left only bureaucratic explanations behind. Thunder 01, Wraith 07. I have multiple contacts bearing 042, range 15 miles, altitude unknown. They're not squawking IFF and not showing on my data link. Recommend we investigate. Morrison's response came back fast and hard, authority crackling through the radio static. Wraith 07, Thunder 01. You will return to patrol pattern immediately. That's a direct order. Do not deviate from assigned mission parameters. But Alina's contrails were still visible ahead, faint white lines against the star field, pointing toward those unknown aircraft like arrows shot by a dead woman's ghost. Kestrel had made a promise under a desert sky, and promises to the dead carried more weight than orders from the living. She pushed her throttles forward and continued northeast, toward whatever truth was waiting in the darkness. The ghost planes were climbing now, their thermal signatures blooming on her infrared display like artificial stars being born in the Nevada night. 12 aircraft. No, 13. 14. More contacts appearing as she closed range, their heat signatures resolving into the familiar profile of F-22 Raptors. But these weren't showing up on the Air Force's tracking systems. These didn't officially exist. Just like Alina's final mission hadn't officially existed. Just like whatever had killed her 3 years ago in this same piece of classified airspace. Kestrel's hands were steady on the controls, but her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird demanding freedom. She was 10 minutes and 12 miles away from answers that someone had been willing to kill to protect. Alina's ghost was guiding her toward a truth that powerful people had buried with classification stamps and official denials. The kind of truth that ended careers, destroyed lives, and sometimes made pilots disappear into the bureaucratic equivalent of unmarked graves. But promises to the dead were sacred things, especially promises made by warriors to warriors under skies full of falling stars. Alina had trusted her with the truth's location. Now it was time to honor that trust, whatever the consequences. Kestrel adjusted her intercept course and prepared to meet whatever ghosts were waiting in the Nevada darkness, where secrets went to die and the dead refused to stay silent. Behind her, Morrison's voice continued crackling through the radio, demanding compliance, threatening consequences, invoking regulations and chains of command. But ahead of her, Alina's contrails were brightening against the star field, becoming more solid, more real, as if the dead woman's determination was giving them substance in the physical world. The promise was calling. The truth was waiting. And Major Kestrel Wraith, Voss, was finally ready to answer both. The unknown aircraft were definitely F-22s now, their distinctive profiles unmistakable even at this distance and altitude. But they were flying in a formation she'd never seen before, a complex pattern that suggested coordination far beyond anything in the standard tactical manual. These weren't Air Force pilots running a classified exercise. These were something else entirely. Something that existed in the spaces between official records, in the budgets that never appeared in congressional hearings, in the operations that happened when democracy needed plausible deniability. Alina had stumbled onto this same formation 3 years ago. Alina had asked the same questions that were now forming in Kestrel's mind. Alina had followed the same contrails into the same restricted airspace, seeking the same truth that was now calling to her wingman across the grave. The difference was that Alina had come alone, trusting in official channels and proper procedures. Kestrel was coming with foreknowledge, with suspicion, with the bitter wisdom earned by watching a friend disappear into the machinery of classified operations. Wraith 07, Thunder 01. Final warning. Return to patrol pattern or I will declare you in violation of direct orders and initiate emergency protocols. Emergency protocols. That was military speak for shooting down one of your own people if they refused to comply with classified mission parameters. It had happened before, in airspace like this, to pilots who had seen too much and asked too many questions. The official reports always blamed mechanical failure, pilot error, tragic accidents that left no witnesses, and no evidence of anything more sinister than the inherent dangers of military aviation. But Alina's ghost was still writing messages in the sky ahead, and promises to the dead carried more authority than emergency protocols issued by the living. Kestrel checked her defensive systems one more time and continued her intercept course toward whatever truth was waiting in the darkness. If Morrison wanted to shoot her down for honoring a 3-year-old promise, he'd have to do it in front of 11 other pilots and explain it to their families afterward. The unknown F-22s were turning now, adjusting their formation as if they detected her approach. But they weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were waiting, hovering in the darkness like mechanical angels guarding secrets that officially didn't exist. Alina's contrails pointed directly toward their center mass, toward whatever revelation she died trying to protect. The dead woman's ghost had led her wingman home at last, to the truth that both of them had sworn to find. Kestrel armed her defensive systems and prepared to meet the ghosts that flew without official sanction in the Nevada night, where promises to the dead carried more weight than orders from the living, and where the truth was finally ready to reveal itself to someone brave enough to follow contrails written in a dead woman's hand. The lead unknown aircraft was transmitting now, not on military frequencies, but on the emergency channel that all pilots monitored regardless of mission classification. The voice that emerged from Kestrel's headset was impossible, familiar, carrying the accent and inflection patterns she'd heard in 1,000 shared conversations over 3 years of friendship and partnership. Alina's voice, speaking from beyond whatever grave the Air Force had assigned her, clear and strong and undeniably alive. Wraith, is that really you out there? I've been waiting such a long time for you to follow the breadcrumbs home. Alina's F-22 detached itself from the formation, its navigation lights blinking in the pattern they'd used to identify each other during night operations in Afghanistan. The same pattern Alina had used the night she'd supposedly died in this restricted airspace, flying a mission that officially never happened. Kestrel's hands trembled on the controls as 3 years of grief and guilt and unanswered questions collapsed into the impossible reality of her wingman's survival. Elena, Kestrel's voice cracked like a teenager's professional composure shattered by the emotional whiplash of resurrection. How is this possible? You're dead. They said you were dead. They gave your family a folded flag. They said a lot of things that weren't true, Elena replied, her F-22 pulling alongside Kestrel's aircraft with the precision of a pilot who'd spent countless hours in formation flight. They needed me to disappear for a while. They needed both of us to believe certain things about classified operations and national security. But the mission's changed now. The truth is more important than the cover story. Behind them, Morrison's voice continued crackling through the radio, demanding compliance, threatening emergency protocols, invoking the authority of chains of command that suddenly seemed less absolute than they had moments earlier. But his threats carried no weight against the reality of Elena's presence, the impossible fact of her survival, the truth that she'd been hidden rather than killed in whatever classified operation had supposedly claimed her life. "What mission?" Kestrel asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The formation of unmarked F-22s, the restricted airspace, the elaborate deception that had kept Elena hidden for 3 years, all of it pointed towards something much larger than a routine training accident. Something that required living pilots to become official ghosts, operating in the shadows of the military-industrial complex, where democracy's messiest problems got solved without congressional oversight or public accountability. "The mission to keep America safe from threats that don't officially exist," Elena replied. "Threats that require responses that don't officially happen. We're the pilots who don't exist, flying aircraft that aren't in any inventory, carrying out operations that never happened. When democracy needs to get its hands dirty, we're the ones who do the washing." The truth hit Kestrel like a physical blow. Elena hadn't died. She'd been recruited into some kind of classified program that operated outside normal military channels, a shadow air force tasked with missions too sensitive for official acknowledgement. The elaborate deception of her death had been necessary to sever her ties with the documented world, to make her available for operations that required complete deniability. It was elegant, efficient, and absolutely terrifying in its implications for military oversight and civilian control of the armed forces. "Why now?" Kestrel asked. "Why reveal yourself after 3 years of letting me think you were dead?" Elena's response carried weight beyond her words, the accumulated burden of 3 years spent operating in the shadow world where patriots became ghosts and democracy's darkest necessities found their expression. "Because the mission's expanding. Because we need pilots we can trust, pilots who understand what's really at stake. Because I kept my promise too, Wraith. I told you I'd find a way home, and this is it. This is the way home for both of us." Around them, the formation of Ghost F-22s maintained their precise spacing, their pilots invisible behind darkened visors, but their presence speaking to the scale of whatever program had swallowed Elena 3 years ago. How many other officially dead pilots were flying these missions? How many other families had received folded flags for airmen who were actually operating in the classified shadows of American power? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, each answer revealing 10 new mysteries about the true nature of military service in the 21st century. "You want me to join you," Kestrel said, though it wasn't really a question. The entire elaborate revelation, the contrails written in Elena's personal code, the orchestrated meeting in restricted airspace, all of it had been designed to bring her to this moment of choice. Disappear into the shadow world where patriots became ghosts, or return to the documented Air Force where uncomfortable questions led to weather reconnaissance in Alaska. "I want you to save your country," Elena replied, her voice carrying the weight of 3 years spent fighting wars that officially didn't exist against enemies that posed no classified threat to American democracy. "The documented military can only do so much, Wraith. Some threats require responses that can't survive congressional oversight or media scrutiny. We're the sharp end of American power when it needs to operate without fingerprints." Morrison's voice had gone silent on the radio, but Kestrel could see his F-22 in the distance, holding position with the rest of the official formation. Waiting. Watching. Ready to implement emergency protocols if she made the wrong choice, if she chose friendship over duty, if she followed Alina into whatever classified program was offering her resurrection in exchange for her official existence. The decision would be permanent. There would be no coming back from the shadow world, where democracy's darkest necessities found their operational expression. But Alina was alive. Alina was waiting. Alina had kept her own promise to find a way home, and now she was extending that same possibility to the wingman who'd spent 3 years mourning her official death. The silver cross at Kestrel's throat seemed to grow warmer, as if Alina's gift was responding to her physical presence, blessing the reunion that had been 3 years in the making. "What do I have to do?" Kestrel asked, though she already knew the answer would change everything about her life, her identity, her place in the documented world where Major Kestrel Voss existed as a person with a history and a future, and a family that would mourn her if she disappeared into the classified shadows. "Follow me," Alina said, her F-22 banking away from the formation toward a heading that would take them deeper into restricted airspace, toward facilities that didn't appear on any official maps, toward a truth that would either save American democracy or destroy it, in the name of protecting it from threats that officially didn't exist. Kestrel looked back once at Morrison's formation, at the documented Air Force where she'd built a career and a reputation, and a life that made sense according to the official rules of military service. Then she looked ahead at Alina's aircraft, at the wingman she'd thought was dead, at the promise of truth that had sustained her through 3 years of unanswered questions and bureaucratic lies. The choice was no choice at all. She'd made her decision 3 years ago under a desert sky full of falling stars, when she'd promised to find the truth no matter what it cost. She pushed her throttles forward and followed Alina into the darkness, toward whatever classified reality was waiting in the Nevada night, where ghosts flew F-22s and democracy's darkest secrets found their expression in the space between official existence and absolute denial. Behind her, Morrison's voice returned to the radio, crisp and professional, reporting another tragic accident in restricted airspace, another skilled pilot lost to the inherent dangers of military aviation. By morning, there would be paperwork and condolences and a folded flag for Kestrel's family, just as there had been for Alina's 3 years earlier. But the truth was more complex than official reports suggested. In the shadow world where patriots became ghosts, death was just another form of operational security, and promises to the dead carried more authority than orders from the living. Kestrel followed Alina's navigation lights deeper into the classified darkness, toward a reunion that had been 3 years in the making, and a truth that would reshape everything she thought she knew about military service in the modern era. The Nevada night closed around them like a blessing, hiding their passage from satellites and radar stations, from congressional oversight and media scrutiny, from all the documented apparatus of democratic accountability. They were ghosts now, operating in the spaces between official existence and absolute denial, carrying out missions that never happened in service of a country that officially didn't acknowledge their sacrifice. It was terrifying and necessary and absolutely inevitable, given the nature of modern threats and the limitations of traditional military responses. Alina's voice crackled through the radio one more time, warm with the affection of friendship survived and promises kept. "Welcome home, Wraith. Welcome to the truth." The facility materialized out of the desert darkness like something from a fever dream of military-industrial efficiency, its runways and hangars carved into the landscape with the precision of surgical instruments. No lights marked its boundaries, no towers guided aircraft to safe landings, no signs announced its purpose or acknowledged its existence. It was a hole in the official world, a place where classified operations found their physical expression and ghost pilots landed aircraft that weren't supposed to exist. Alina's F-22 descended toward the primary runway with the confidence of familiarity. Her navigation lights the only illumination in the vast darkness. Kestrel followed her wingman down, trusting in instruments and memory to guide her toward whatever truth was waiting on the ground. The runway surface was perfect, newly paved and precisely maintained, speaking to funding streams that bypassed normal congressional appropriations and engineering standards that exceeded anything in the documented military infrastructure. They landed in formation, their engines spooling down to silence as ground crews emerged from hidden positions to service aircraft that officially didn't exist. The crews worked with practiced efficiency, their faces hidden behind night vision equipment, their voices reduced to hand signals and coded light patterns. Everything about the operation spoke to years of refinement, to procedures developed through repetition and perfected through necessity. Kestrel shut down her systems and prepared to meet whatever reality existed beyond her cockpit. The canopy raised with its familiar hydraulic whine, but the air that entered her helmet carried unfamiliar scents, chemicals and electronics, and something that might have been hope mixed with equal parts fear and determination. This was Alina's world now, the classified reality where she'd spent 3 years fighting wars that officially didn't exist. Alina's voice came through the darkness, physically present for the first time in 3 years, carrying the warmth and affection that had sustained their friendship through 2 combat deployments and countless training missions. "It's good to see you, Wraith. Really see you, not just radar contacts and radio voices." She stood beside Kestrel's aircraft, her flight suit bearing no insignia, no name tags, no identification beyond the generic efficiency of military clothing designed for function rather than recognition. Her face was thinner than Kestrel remembered, marked by 3 years of stress and classified knowledge, but her eyes held the same intelligence and determination that had made her one of the Air Force's most promising pilots before her official death. "Alina," Kestrel's voice broke on her friend's name, 3 years of grief and guilt dissolving into the simple reality of physical presence. She climbed down from her aircraft and embraced the ghost who'd led her home, feeling solid flesh and warm breath, and the beating of a heart that officially stopped 3 years ago in a classified accident that never happened. "I know you have questions," Alina said, stepping back but keeping her hands on Kestrel's shoulders, maintaining the physical connection that proved her resurrection was real rather than hallucination or wish fulfillment. "I know this is overwhelming. I know it changes everything you thought you knew about military service and national security, and the price we pay for protecting democracy from threats it can't officially acknowledge." Around them, the facility hummed with purposeful activity, ground crews and technicians and personnel whose faces remained hidden in the darkness, but whose efficiency spoke to long experience with classified operations. Hangars opened to reveal more F-22s, aircraft bearing no national markings, no squadron insignia, no identification beyond serial numbers that wouldn't appear in any official inventory. It was a shadow air force equipped with the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, operating outside normal chains of command and congressional oversight. "How many?" Kestrel asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. How many officially dead pilots were operating from facilities like this? How many families had received folded flags for airmen who were actually fighting classified wars in the shadows of American democracy? The scale suggested something far beyond individual recruitment, something that approached a parallel military structure accountable only to itself. "Enough," Alina replied, her voice carrying the weight of operational security and hard-won wisdom about the nature of modern warfare. "Enough to handle threats that can't be addressed through normal diplomatic or military channels. Enough to protect American interests when official responses would create more problems than they solved. Not enough to constitute a threat to civilian control of the military, but enough to provide options when democracy's traditional tools prove inadequate." They walked toward the facility's main building, their boots silent on pavement that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it, their voices low in deference to security protocols that had been developed through years of operational experience. The building itself was unremarkable, government-standard architecture designed for function rather than aesthetics, but its interior revealed technology and resources that exceeded anything in the documented military infrastructure. Alina led her through corridors lined with classified briefing rooms, past workstations where analysts processed intelligence that officially didn't exist, through secure communications centers that connected this facility with similar installations around the world. It was impressive and terrifying in equal measure. A shadow government's military arm operating with resources and authority that bypassed every constitutional safeguard designed to prevent the emergence of an unaccountable security apparatus. "Who's in charge?" Kestrel asked, though she suspected the answer would reveal layers of classification and compartmentalization that would take years to fully understand. The facility's scale and sophistication suggested backing from the highest levels of government, resources allocated through budgets that never appeared in public documentation, authority granted through executive orders that would never see congressional review. People who understand that democracy's survival sometimes requires operating outside democratic processes, Alina replied, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd spent 3 years learning to navigate the moral complexities of shadow operations. People who have concluded that some threats to American security are too sensitive for normal political oversight, too urgent for normal bureaucratic processes, too dangerous for normal military responses. They entered a briefing room where maps covered the walls, showing global threat assessments and operational theaters that wouldn't appear in any public strategic documentation. Red dots marked current crisis points, yellow zones indicated emerging threats, green areas represented successful interventions that had prevented larger conflicts. The scope was global, the resources apparently unlimited, the authority derived from sources that transcended normal civilian control of military operations. A man in civilian clothes stood with his back to them, studying a display that showed real-time intelligence from the Middle East. When he turned, Kestrel recognized him immediately. General Marcus Reed, formerly chairman of the Joint Chiefs, officially retired but apparently still active in whatever classified program had recruited Alina and was now recruiting her. His presence explained the resources, the authority, the ability to operate outside normal military channels with apparent impunity. "Major Voss," Reed's voice carried the authority of decades in uniform and the weight of knowledge that extended far beyond anything available through normal intelligence channels. "Welcome to the reality behind the classified reports. Welcome to the war that officially doesn't exist, fought by soldiers who officially aren't alive, against enemies that officially pose no threat to American democracy." His words carried the cadence of briefings delivered countless times to pilots who'd made the same choice Kestrel was now facing, warriors who'd chosen classified truth over comfortable denial. Reed gestured toward chairs arranged around a conference table that looked like it belonged in the Pentagon's most secure briefing rooms. "Please, sit. What I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change your understanding of American military power and your role in protecting democratic institutions from threats they can't publicly acknowledge." Kestrel took a seat beside Alina, drawing comfort from her friend's physical presence while grappling with the implications of Reed's words. The general remained standing, his posture conveying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected global stability without congressional oversight or public accountability. Behind him, the wall displays showed continuing updates from crisis zones around the world, intelligence streams that painted a picture of threats far more complex than anything discussed in public policy debates. "3 years ago," Reed began, his voice carrying the weight of operational necessity and hard choices made in service of national security, Captain Reyes stumbled onto evidence of a terrorist network planning coordinated attacks on American infrastructure. Nuclear facilities, power grids, communications nodes, targets chosen to maximize economic disruption and civilian casualties. The intelligence was solid, the threat was imminent, and the traditional response options were inadequate. Alina's expression remained neutral, but Kestrel could see tension in her shoulders, the physical manifestation of memories that carried their own operational security classification. Whatever had happened 3 years ago, whatever had necessitated Alina's official death and recruitment into this shadow program, it had been significant enough to justify extraordinary measures and permanent separation from the documented world. The network had infiltrated legitimate refugee populations, embedded themselves in communities across 12 different states, positioned themselves to strike simultaneously at targets that would cripple American infrastructure for months if not years. Reed continued, his words painting a picture of threat assessment that exceeded anything discussed in public terrorism briefings. Traditional law enforcement lacked the jurisdiction and resources for a coordinated response. Military intervention would have required congressional authorization and public disclosure that would have alerted the network to our knowledge of their plans. The implications crystallized in Kestrel's mind like ice forming in her veins. Reed was describing the kind of threat that required immediate, decisive action outside normal constitutional processes, the kind of situation that justified shadow operations and plausible deniability. Alina had been recruited not just to fly classified missions, but to participate in counterterrorism operations that bypassed every legal safeguard designed to prevent military action against civilian populations on American soil. "So you killed her officially and recruited her unofficially," Kestrel said, her voice carrying accusation and understanding in equal measure. "You made her disappear into this program so she could carry out operations that can't survive legal scrutiny or public accountability. We gave her the opportunity to save lives when normal procedures would have resulted in mass casualties," Reed replied, his tone suggesting long experience with moral objections from newly recruited personnel. "The network was neutralized, the infrastructure attacks were prevented, and American democracy continued functioning without ever knowing how close it came to catastrophic disruption. That's the mission, Major Voss. That's what we do here. We handle the threats that democracy can't officially acknowledge." Alina spoke for the first time since entering the briefing room, her voice carrying the weight of 3 years spent operating in the moral gray areas where national security and constitutional law intersected. "It's not what I expected when I took the oath to support and defend the Constitution. But it's what the Constitution requires when traditional methods prove inadequate to protect democratic institutions from existential threats." The wall displays showed global crisis indicators, threat assessments, ongoing operations that spanned continents and crossed jurisdictional boundaries with apparent ease. The scale suggested resources and authority that exceeded anything available to documented military units, capabilities that could only exist through funding streams and command structures that bypassed normal congressional oversight. It was impressive and terrifying, a shadow government's military arm operating with unlimited resources in service of missions that officially didn't exist. "What's my role in this?" Kestrel asked, though she suspected the answer would involve the same permanent separation from documented existence that Alina had accepted 3 years earlier. Once you entered the shadow world, there was no returning to normal military service, no going back to the comfortable certainties of official duty and constitutional constraints on military action. Reed's expression softened slightly, revealing hints of the man who'd spent 4 decades in uniform serving democracy, before concluding that its survival sometimes required operating outside democratic processes. "Your role is whatever your skills and conscience allow, Major. We don't conscript personnel into classified operations. We offer opportunities to serve national security interests when traditional methods prove inadequate. The choice is always yours." But the choice wasn't really a choice, Kestrel realized. She'd seen too much, learned too much, understood too much about the shadow operations that kept American democracy functioning in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. She could accept recruitment into the program, or she could return to the documented Air Force with knowledge that would make her a security risk requiring permanent monitoring and potential silencing. Reed was offering her the illusion of choice, while making clear that only one option led to continued existence in any meaningful sense. "What happened to Morrison?" she asked, remembering the lieutenant colonel's threats about emergency protocols and weather reconnaissance in Alaska. His knowledge of Alina's contrails, his warnings about digging too deep into classified operations, suggested involvement in whatever program was now recruiting her. "Colonel Morrison has been briefing potential recruits for this program for 18 months, Alina replied, her voice carrying amusement at Kestrel's surprise. "His threats were part of the selection process. We needed to know if you'd follow orders when pressured, or if you'd honor promises to friends when official authority demanded compliance. You chose correctly." The revelation added another layer to the evening's complexity. Morrison's apparent hostility had been performance, his threats designed to test her commitment to finding the truth rather than accepting comfortable lies. The entire elaborate scenario, the contrails, the restricted airspace, the confrontation with official authority, had been orchestrated to bring her to this moment of choice with full knowledge of what was at stake. "How many others?" Kestrel asked, gesturing toward the facility around them, the resources and personnel that suggested a recruitment program operating for years rather than months. "How many officially dead pilots are actually serving in this program?" "Enough to handle current operational requirements," Reed replied, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to discuss classified programs without revealing specific numbers or capabilities. "Not enough to constitute a threat to civilian control of the military, but enough to provide options when democracy's traditional tools prove inadequate to address existential threats." The same answer Alina had given earlier, Kestrel noted. Either they were sticking to prepared talking points, or the program's scale was classified beyond her current security clearance level. Both possibilities suggested operational security protocols developed through years of experience with shadow operations and personnel management in classified environments. Alina stood and gestured toward the door, her movement suggesting their formal briefing was concluding and more practical considerations were about to begin. "If you're ready, I'll show you the rest of the facility. The training programs, the mission planning centers, the aircraft you'll be flying if you decide to join us. It's impressive, Wraith. We have resources and capabilities that exceed anything in the documented military." They walked deeper into the facility, past laboratories where technicians worked on classified weapons systems, through workshops where engineers modified aircraft for missions that officially didn't exist, along corridors lined with portraits of personnel who died in shadow operations around the world. The scale was staggering, the technology cutting edge, the human cost carefully documented for internal purposes while remaining invisible to public accountability. "Do you ever regret it?" Kestrel asked as they paused before a memorial wall honoring classified casualties from operations that would never appear in official military histories. "Do you ever wonder if we're protecting democracy by undermining the constitutional principles it's supposed to represent?" Alina was quiet for a long moment, studying the names and faces of colleagues who died in service of missions that couldn't survive public scrutiny. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 3 years spent grappling with moral complexities that had no clear resolution. "Every day. But then I remember the infrastructure attacks we prevented, the terrorist networks we disrupted, the American lives we saved by operating outside normal legal constraints. The Constitution is a framework for governance, not a suicide pact. Sometimes protecting democratic institutions requires actions that can't survive democratic oversight." They entered a hangar where rows of F-22s waited in perfect maintenance condition, their surfaces gleaming under overhead lights, their weapons pylons configured for missions that span the spectrum from reconnaissance to direct action. Ground crews moved among the aircraft with practiced efficiency, their faces hidden behind security protocols, but their expertise evident in every gesture and procedure. "Your aircraft," Alina said, gesturing toward a Raptor bearing the tail number 74195, the same designation as Kestrel's documented fighter but modified for classified operations. Same engines, same avionics, same weapon systems, but configured for missions that require complete operational security. No transponders, no data links, no electronic signatures that could compromise classified operations or personnel. Kestrel ran her hand along the aircraft's wing, feeling the familiar texture of composite materials and precision engineering, while grappling with the implications of flying missions that officially didn't exist. The F-22 represented the pinnacle of American aerospace technology, and seeing it configured for shadow operations drove home the resources and authority behind whatever program had recruited Alina and was now recruiting her. "What's the first mission?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would involve the kind of operational complexity that required pilots willing to operate outside normal legal constraints. The facility's scale and sophistication suggested ongoing global operations that spanned continents and crossed jurisdictional boundaries with apparent ease. Alina's expression grew serious, her voice carrying the weight of classified knowledge and operational urgency. "There's a situation developing in Eastern Europe. Russian aircraft conducting reconnaissance flights over NATO airspace, probing response times and defensive capabilities. Traditional diplomatic protests have been ineffective, and escalating to military intercepts risks broader conflict. We need pilots capable of deterrent operations that can't be attributed to any NATO member. Ghost pilots flying ghost missions against adversaries who posed threats that couldn't be addressed through normal diplomatic or military channels. It was exactly the kind of scenario that required shadow operations and plausible deniability, the intersection of geopolitical necessity and constitutional limitation that created the operational space where Alina's program existed. "When do we deploy?" Kestrel asked, though she hadn't consciously made the decision to join the program. The question emerged from instincts developed through years of military service, the warrior's reflexive response to mission briefings and operational requirements. Somewhere in the past hour, she'd crossed the line from horrified observer to willing participant in whatever classified reality had claimed Alina 3 years earlier. "Tomorrow night," Alina replied, her voice carrying satisfaction at Kestrel's unconscious commitment to the mission. "We'll brief details in the morning, but the operational window is narrow. Russian reconnaissance flights are scheduled to probe NATO airspace over the Baltic states, and we need to establish deterrent presence without triggering Article 5 responses that could escalate to broader conflict." The mission parameters crystallized in Kestrel's mind like a tactical problem, requiring immediate solution. Intercept Russian aircraft in international airspace, demonstrate superior capability without revealing national identity, establish deterrent effect that would discourage future provocations, without providing evidence that could be used for diplomatic protests or military escalation. It was exactly the kind of mission that required pilots willing to operate in the legal and political gray areas, where national security interests intersected with constitutional constraints. "What about my family?" Kestrel asked, remembering the sister in Colorado who sent birthday cards, the parents in Ohio who called every Sunday, the network of relationships that would be severed by her official death and recruitment into Alina's shadow program. What happens to them when Major Kestrel Voss dies in a training accident? Alina's expression softened, revealing the personal cost of decisions made in service of classified operations and national security interests. "They grieve. They receive condolences from people who never knew you. They're told you died serving your country in ways that can't be fully disclosed due to operational security requirements. It's the hardest part, Wraith. Harder than the missions, harder than the moral complexities, harder than operating outside constitutional constraints. You die to the people who love you, so you can live to serve the people who will never know you existed. The price was higher than Kestrel had anticipated, more personal than she'd prepared for. Military service had always involved risk to life and limb, but this program required death of identity, severance from every relationship that defined her existence outside the cockpit. Alina had paid that price 3 years ago, accepting the role of ghost pilot in service of threats that democracy couldn't officially acknowledge. But the alternative was returning to documented service with knowledge that made her a security risk, accepting weather reconnaissance in Alaska while knowing that classified threats to American democracy required responses that couldn't survive public scrutiny. The choice was no choice at all, just as it had been for Alina, just as it was for every pilot recruited into whatever shadow program operated from this facility in the Nevada desert. "I'm in," Kestrel said, her voice carrying finality and resignation in equal measure. "I'll take the mission. I'll pay the price. I'll serve the truth that democracy can't afford to acknowledge." Alina smiled, the first genuine expression of joy Kestrel had seen since their reunion in the restricted airspace, where promises to the dead carried more authority than orders from the living. "Welcome to the Shadow Air Force, Wraith. Welcome to the war that officially doesn't exist, fought by pilots who officially aren't alive, against enemies that officially pose no threat to American democracy." Around them, the facility hummed with purposeful activity, ground crews preparing aircraft for missions that would never appear in official records, technicians modifying weapon systems for operations that required complete plausible deniability, personnel whose existence was classified at levels that transcended normal security protocols. It was impressive and terrifying and absolutely necessary, given the nature of modern threats and the limitations of traditional military responses. General Reed appeared beside them, his presence suggesting the formal recruitment process was nearing completion. "There are documents to sign, Major Voss. Agreements that formalize your commitment to operational security and mission success. Your official death will be processed through normal channels, your personal effects distributed to your family according to military protocols, your service record sealed under classification levels that will never be declassified." The bureaucracy of official death, Kestrel realized. Even shadow operations required paperwork, legal frameworks that provided operational cover, and protected personnel from prosecution for actions taken in service of classified missions. She would sign her name to documents that erased her existence from the documented world, while binding her to service in the shadow reality where Alina had operated for 3 years. "What's my new call sign?" she asked, understanding that Wraith belonged to the documented Major Kestrel Voss who would die in tomorrow's official reports. The Shadow Air Force would require new identities, new call signs, new names that carried no connection to the people they'd been before crossing the line into classified service. "Phoenix," Alina replied, her voice carrying symbolic weight that transcended simple radio identification. "You're rising from the ashes of your documented death to serve truth that democracy can't afford to acknowledge. It seemed appropriate." Phoenix, rising from official death to serve classified truth in the shadow spaces where American democracy fought for survival against threats it couldn't publicly acknowledge. The name carried weight, responsibility, and the promise of missions that would test every skill she developed through 23 combat deployments and countless training exercises. It was perfect and terrifying and absolutely appropriate for whatever lay ahead in the Nevada night, where ghosts flew F-22s and promises to the dead carried more authority than orders from the living. Tomorrow she would die officially, tragically, heroically in service of the documented Air Force that had shaped her career and defined her identity for 15 years of military service. Tomorrow night, she would rise as Phoenix, shadow pilot serving classified truth in operations that required complete operational security and absolute plausible deniability. The transformation would be permanent, irreversible, and absolutely necessary, given the nature of threats that democracy couldn't afford to acknowledge through normal political processes. Alina guided her toward the administrative complex, where her official death would be processed through military bureaucracy, while her classified resurrection was documented through security protocols that would never see congressional oversight or public accountability. The paperwork of shadow operations, the legal frameworks that allowed democratic institutions to fight for survival using methods that couldn't survive democratic scrutiny. The documents were extensive, covering operational security requirements, mission parameters, personnel policies, and chain of command structures that bypassed normal military hierarchy. Kestrel signed her name dozens of times, each signature binding her more completely to service that would never be acknowledged, missions that would never appear in official military histories, sacrifices that would never be honored in public ceremonies. "Welcome to Phoenix Squadron," Reed said as she finished the final document, his voice carrying the weight of authority and the burden of command decisions that affected global stability without congressional oversight. "Your training begins at 0600 tomorrow. Your first operational mission deploys in 72 hours. Your service to American democracy begins the moment you officially die serving the documented military." Phoenix Squadron, a unit that didn't exist, equipped with aircraft that weren't in any official inventory, tasked with missions that were too sensitive for normal political oversight. Alina's program had a name, a structure, a chain of command that operated in the shadow spaces where democracy's darkest necessities found their operational expression. Kestrel was no longer an individual recruit. She was part of a classified military unit with global responsibilities and unlimited resources. The administrative process complete, Alina led her to quarters that would serve as home for however long her classified service continued. The room was Spartan but comfortable, military-standard furnishing with personal touches that suggested long-term occupancy by personnel who'd made permanent commitments to shadow operations. A bed, a desk, a closet containing flight suits that bore no insignia, no name tags, no identification beyond the generic efficiency of military clothing designed for classified service. "Get some rest," Alina advised, her voice carrying the fatigue of someone who'd spent 3 years adapting to life in the shadow world where patriots became ghosts and democracy's survival required operating outside democratic processes. "Tomorrow's training will be intensive. We'll cover mission parameters, operational security protocols, weapons systems modifications, and communication procedures for classified operations. It's a lot to absorb." Alone in her quarters, Kestrel sat on the edge of the bed and removed the silver cross Alina had given her 3 years ago, the physical reminder of promises made under a desert sky full of falling stars. The metal was warm against her palm, as if Alina's gift had absorbed heat from her body over the years. She'd worn it in memory of a friend who wasn't actually dead. Now Alina was alive, the promise was fulfilled, and Kestrel was committed to service that required her own official death in exchange for classified resurrection. She thought about her family in Ohio, her sister in Colorado, the network of relationships that would mourn her loss while she served truth they could never acknowledge. The personal cost was staggering, the sacrifice more complete than anything she'd contemplated during her documented military service. But Alina had paid the same price, accepted the same isolation, chosen classified truth over comfortable relationships with people who could never understand the nature of modern threats to democratic institutions. Outside her window, the Nevada desert stretched toward horizons that held secrets classified at levels beyond normal security protocols. Somewhere in that darkness, other facilities housed other shadow units tasked with protecting American democracy, through methods that couldn't survive democratic scrutiny. Phoenix Squadron was part of a larger apparatus, a shadow government's military arm operating with resources and authority that transcended constitutional constraints on military action. Tomorrow she would begin training for missions that officially didn't exist, learning to fly operations that required complete operational security and absolute plausible deniability. Tomorrow night, she would deploy as Phoenix, shadow pilot serving classified truth in the gray areas where national security interests intersected with legal limitations on military response. The transformation would be complete, irreversible, and absolutely necessary, given the threats that democracy couldn't afford to acknowledge. Alina's voice echoed in her memory. "Welcome home, Wraith. Welcome to the truth." But home was different now, truth more complex than she'd anticipated. The Shadow Air Force was home to pilots who'd chosen classified service over documented existence, warriors who protected democracy by operating outside its constitutional constraints. It was necessary and terrifying and absolutely vital, given the nature of modern warfare and the limitations of traditional military responses. Kestrel placed the silver cross on her nightstand and prepared for sleep that would be her last as Major Kestrel Voss, documented officer of the United States Air Force. Tomorrow she would die officially and rise as Phoenix, shadow pilot committed to missions that would test every skill she developed through 15 years of military service. The promise to Alina was fulfilled, but new promises awaited in the classified dawn where ghost pilots protected democratic institutions through methods that democracy couldn't afford to acknowledge. The Nevada night was silent outside her window, empty desert holding secrets that spanned continents and affected global stability. But it wasn't empty, she realized. It was full of possibilities, classified operations, shadow pilots serving truth that transcended normal political processes. Alina was out there somewhere, preparing for tomorrow's training, tomorrow's mission, tomorrow's opportunity to serve American democracy through methods that couldn't survive American oversight. Sleep came eventually, carrying dreams of flight and friendship, of promises kept and truths revealed, of service that required ultimate sacrifice in the name of democratic institutions that could never acknowledge the price paid for their survival. In her dreams, she flew formation with Alina above a desert landscape where contrails wrote messages in dead women's code, where ghost pilots served classified truth, where promises to the dead carried more authority than orders from the living. Morning arrived with the harsh efficiency of military routine, reveille sounding across the facility at precisely 0530 local time. Kestrel woke to the sound of aircraft engines spooling up in distant hangars, ground crews beginning daily maintenance routines, personnel preparing for another day of classified operations that would never appear in official military reports. Phoenix Squadron was operational around the clock, she realized, deployed globally in service of threats that required immediate response regardless of time zones or political considerations. Alina knocked on her door at 0545, carrying coffee and the professional bearing of someone who'd adapted to life in the shadow world, where democracy's darkest necessities found their operational expression. "Ready for your first day as a dead woman?" she asked, her tone carrying humor that couldn't quite mask the underlying seriousness of classified service requirements. "As ready as anyone can be for official death and classified resurrection," Kestrel replied, accepting the coffee and the reality that her documented existence would end within hours. Somewhere in the administrative machinery of military bureaucracy, forms were being processed that would notify her family of a training accident, a tragic loss of skilled pilot to the inherent dangers of military aviation. They would grieve genuinely while she served truth they could never acknowledge. They walked toward the briefing complex through corridors bustling with classified activity, personnel preparing for missions that spanned the globe in service of American democracy's survival against threats it couldn't publicly acknowledge. The scale was staggering, the resources apparently unlimited, the authority derived from sources that transcended normal civilian control of military operations. Phoenix Squadron was part of something much larger than a single classified unit. The briefing room was packed with pilots she didn't recognize, men and women bearing no insignia, no name tags, no identification beyond the professional competence evident in their bearing and discussion. Shadow pilots serving classified truth, ghost warriors protecting democratic institutions through methods that couldn't survive democratic scrutiny. They welcomed her with the easy camaraderie of people who'd made similar sacrifices, similar choices, similar commitments to service that required official death in exchange for classified resurrection. General Reed took the podium with the authority of someone accustomed to briefing operations that affected global stability without congressional oversight or public accountability. Behind him, wall displays showed intelligence updates from crisis zones around the world, threat assessments that painted a picture of challenges far more complex than anything discussed in public policy debates. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reed began, his voice carrying the weight of classified knowledge and operational urgency, "we have developing situations in 3 theaters that require immediate Phoenix Squadron response. Eastern Europe, where Russian reconnaissance flights continue probing NATO defensive capabilities. The South China Sea, where Chinese military exercises threaten freedom of navigation operations. The Middle East, where terrorist networks are planning coordinated attacks on Allied infrastructure. 3 simultaneous missions requiring shadow pilots capable of operating outside normal legal constraints, deterrent operations that couldn't be attributed to any democratic government, classified responses to threats that required immediate action rather than prolonged political debate. The scope suggested resources and capabilities that exceeded anything available to documented military units." Alina leaned close to whisper mission assignments. "Your Eastern Europe, Wraith. I mean Phoenix, still getting used to the new call signs." Her voice carried affection and professional confidence in equal measure, the wingman relationship adapted to classified service requirements. "Russian Su-35s conducting reconnaissance flights over Baltic airspace. We intercept, demonstrate superior capability, establish deterrent presence without revealing national identity." The mission parameters crystallized in Kestrel's mind like a tactical problem, requiring immediate solution. Engage Russian military aircraft in international airspace. Showcase F-22 capabilities without providing evidence that could be used for diplomatic protests. Establish psychological deterrent that would discourage future provocations without triggering broader military escalation. It was exactly the kind of operation that required pilots willing to serve in the legal and political gray areas, where national security interests intersected with constitutional constraints. "Mission briefing in 30 minutes, Reed announced, dismissing the assembled pilots to final preparations. "Deployment windows are narrow, operational security is absolute, mission success is essential. Phoenix Squadron represents America's finest pilots serving democracy's most sensitive requirements. Make your country proud, even if your country can never acknowledge your service." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, the burden of serving institutions that could never publicly honor the sacrifice required for their survival. Kestrel felt the responsibility settling on her shoulders like the weight of flight equipment, necessary gear that enabled mission success, while reminding her of the stakes involved in classified operations. She spent the remaining time before briefing studying intelligence reports on Russian air capabilities, reviewing F-22 modifications designed for shadow operations, memorizing communication protocols that would allow coordination without revealing national identity or mission parameters. The preparation was intensive, comprehensive, and absolutely essential given the operational requirements of missions that couldn't survive political oversight or public accountability. The detailed mission briefing revealed the complexity of modern shadow warfare, the intersection of advanced technology and political necessity that created operational space for Phoenix Squadron missions. Russian Su-35 would conduct reconnaissance flights along NATO borders at precisely calculated intervals, probing response times and defensive capabilities while remaining technically within international law. Traditional diplomatic protests had proven ineffective, military intercepts risked escalation to broader conflict, but shadow operations could establish deterrent presence without triggering Article 5 responses. Alina would lead the mission, her 3 years of classified experience providing operational knowledge that new recruits like Kestrel couldn't match. 2 additional Phoenix Squadron pilots would provide backup and electronic warfare support, their aircraft configured for missions that required complete operational security and absolute plausible deniability. The formation would intercept Russian reconnaissance flights in international airspace, demonstrate F-22 superiority through superior positioning and electronic countermeasures, then fade back into classified existence before Russian pilots could identify their national origin or mission parameters. Rules of engagement are defensive only, Reed emphasized, his voice carrying the weight of political necessity and operational constraint. We demonstrate capability, establish deterrent presence, and withdraw without providing evidence that could be used for diplomatic protests or military escalation. These missions succeed through intimidation rather than violence, psychological warfare rather than kinetic action. The distinction was crucial, Kestrel realized. Phoenix Squadron wasn't tasked with starting wars but with preventing them, using superior capability and operational mystery to deter adversaries from actions that would require more dramatic American responses. They were democracy's pressure release valve, providing options when traditional diplomacy proved inadequate but military action would create more problems than it solved. Weapons load was minimal but precisely configured for defensive requirements. AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles for beyond visual range engagement, AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles for close-range combat, electronic warfare pods designed to disrupt enemy communications and targeting systems. The configuration spoke to missions that relied on technological superiority rather than overwhelming firepower, precision rather than destruction. Launch was scheduled for 2100 hours local time, allowing for transit to operational theater under cover of darkness. The mission timeline was tight, operational window narrow, but the intelligence picture suggested Russian reconnaissance flights would proceed according to established patterns that Phoenix Squadron could exploit for maximum deterrent effect. Success would be measured not in enemy aircraft destroyed, but in future provocations deterred through demonstrated capability. Kestrel spent the afternoon in advanced mission planning, studying radar patterns over the Baltic Sea, reviewing Russian flight profiles and electronic signatures, memorizing emergency procedures for classified operations that couldn't rely on normal military support structures. The preparation was comprehensive, reflecting the reality that shadow pilots operated with minimal backup and maximum exposure to political consequences if missions went wrong. Alina found her during the dinner break carrying food that reminded Kestrel of countless shared meals during their documented military service. But everything was different now, seasoned with the knowledge that they were preparing for operations that officially didn't exist in service of truths that democracy couldn't afford to acknowledge. Nervous? Alina asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Every pilot experienced pre-mission tension, the physiological preparation for combat operations that separated warriors from civilians, professionals from amateurs. Terrified, Kestrel admitted, finding comfort in honesty between friends who'd shared too much to pretend professional composure in private moments. Not of the mission, not of the Russians, not of the technical challenges. Terrified of the implications, the precedent we're setting, the constitutional constraints we're circumventing in the name of national security. Alina nodded, her expression revealing 3 years of experience grappling with similar moral complexities. It never gets easier. The missions become routine, the technology becomes familiar, but the questions never stop. Are we protecting democracy or undermining it? Are we serving the Constitution or circumventing it? Are we heroes or traitors to the principles we swore to defend? The questions had no clear answers. Kestrel realized just operational necessities and political constraints that created the gray areas where Phoenix Squadron existed. Modern warfare had evolved beyond the simple moral clarity of historical conflicts, requiring responses that transcended traditional legal frameworks and constitutional limitations. Democracy's survival sometimes required operating outside democratic processes. How do you live with it? Kestrel asked, genuinely curious about the psychological mechanisms that allowed warriors to serve institutions that couldn't acknowledge their sacrifice, protect people who would never know their names, uphold values that sometimes required violating the principles those values represented. By focusing on the mission, Alina replied, her voice carrying the weight of classified knowledge and operational experience. By remembering that every Russian reconnaissance flight we deter prevents broader conflict, every terrorist network we disrupt saves American lives, every threat we neutralize through classified operations prevents escalation that would require public military action and congressional authorization. We serve democracy by operating outside its constraints. The rationalization was elegant, necessary, and probably accurate given the nature of modern threats and the limitations of traditional military responses. But it still required accepting permanent separation from the documented world, official death in exchange for classified resurrection, service that could never be acknowledged by the institutions they protected. The price was higher than Kestrel had anticipated, more personal than she'd prepared for. Pre-flight briefing began at 2000 hours, final intelligence updates showing Russian aircraft maintaining their established reconnaissance patterns. The operational window remained narrow but achievable, weather conditions favorable for classified operations that required complete visual and electronic stealth. Phoenix Squadron aircraft had been configured for maximum operational security, transponders disabled, communications encrypted, weapons loads optimized for deterrent rather than destructive effect. Alina's leadership briefing was precise, professional, comprehensive without being overwhelming. We intercept at 30,000 feet, international airspace, maximum psychological impact through superior positioning and electronic warfare capabilities. Demonstrate F-22 superiority without revealing national identity. Establish deterrent presence without providing evidence for diplomatic protests. Fade back into classified existence before Russian pilots can identify our origin or mission parameters. The mission profile was elegant in its simplicity, relying on technological superiority and operational mystery rather than overwhelming force or dramatic confrontation. Success would be measured in future provocations, deterred rather than enemy aircraft destroyed, psychological warfare rather than kinetic action. It was exactly the kind of operation that required pilots willing to serve in the shadow spaces where national security interests intersected with constitutional constraints. Kestrel suited up with the methodical precision of someone who'd performed the ritual hundreds of times, each piece of equipment serving specific purposes that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But tonight the familiar routine carried additional weight, the knowledge that she was preparing for her first mission as a dead woman serving classified truth in operations that officially didn't exist. The F-22 waited in Hangar 7, its surfaces gleaming under overhead lighting, ground crew performing final checks on systems configured for shadow operations. No national markings, no squadron insignia, no identification beyond serial numbers that wouldn't appear in any official inventory. It was a ghost plane prepared for a ghost pilot serving truth that democracy couldn't afford to acknowledge. Alina appeared beside her aircraft, already suited and ready for departure. Last chance to change your mind, Phoenix. Once we launch, you're committed to classified service for the duration. No going back to documented existence, no return to the comfortable certainties of official military duty. But there had been no real choice from the moment Kestrel saw Elena's contrails writing messages in dead women's code across the Nevada sunset. The promise made 3 years ago under a desert sky full of falling stars had led inevitably to this moment. This mission. This commitment to serve truth that transcended normal political processes. She was Phoenix now, rising from the ashes of documented death to protect democratic institutions through methods that couldn't survive democratic scrutiny. "I'm ready," Kestrel said, her voice carrying finality and determination in equal measure. She climbed into her cockpit, settling into the ejection seat that would carry her toward whatever truth awaited in the international airspace over the Baltic Sea, where Russian reconnaissance flights probed NATO defensive capabilities and shadow pilots served classified deterrent operations. The F-22 systems came alive around her, multi-million-dollar technology responding to her commands like an extension of her own nervous system. But everything was different now, calibrated for missions that required complete operational security and absolute plausible deniability. She was no longer Major Kestrel Voss of the documented United States Air Force. She was Phoenix of the Shadow Squadron that protected democracy by operating outside its constitutional constraints. Elena's voice crackled through encrypted communications. "Phoenix Squadron, this is Phoenix Leader. Pre-flight checks complete, systems nominal, mission parameters confirmed. We launch in 5 minutes to establish deterrent presence against Russian reconnaissance operations. Remember, we exist only in the shadows. We serve only the truth. We return only after mission success." The words carried weight beyond their operational meaning, the burden of serving institutions that could never acknowledge their sacrifice, protecting people who would never know their names, upholding values that sometimes required circumventing the principles those values represented. Phoenix Squadron was democracy's shadow guardian, operating in the gray areas where national security interests intersected with constitutional limitations. Engines spooled up to departure power, their controlled violence preparing to launch 4 Ghost pilots toward a confrontation with Russian military aircraft in international airspace, where the Cold War's echoes still shaped modern geopolitical reality. The mission would succeed through intimidation rather than destruction, technological superiority rather than overwhelming force, operational mystery rather than documented capability. "Phoenix Squadron, you're cleared for departure. Maintain heading 090, climb to flight level 400, contact control on encrypted frequency 777. Mission success, safe return, and remember, officially, this never happened." They launched into the Nevada night, 4 F-22s carrying no identification, leaving no electronic signatures, bound for international airspace where they would confront Russian reconnaissance flights with superior capability and absolute operational mystery. Elena led them northeast toward the mission area, her 3 years of classified experience guiding new recruits like Kestrel toward whatever truth awaited in the gray areas where democracy fought for survival against threats it couldn't publicly acknowledge. The stars above bore witness to their passage, ancient light traveling impossible distances to illuminate shadow warriors serving classified truth in operations that officially